Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth research seminar series in the UCD School of Agriculture and Food Science. I am David McHugh, Associate Dean for Research in the school, and it's a great pleasure today to welcome Professor Gregor Larson from the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford to deliver today's seminar. Gregor received his bachelor's degree in 1996 from a small liberal arts college in California, Claremont McKenna College. His interest in biology was spurred by reading everything Stephen Jay Gould ever wrote over the following years while he wandered the deserts of Turkmenistan, working for an environmental petroleum industry consultancy. Then deciding that evolution was way cooler than oil, Gregor studied at Oxford, the University of Oxford, and then at the University of Colorado before receiving his PhD in zoology in 2006. He received an EMBO postdoctoral fellowship then to study in Uppsala in Sweden, I think with Leif Andersson, a famous scientist in the field of animal genomics, before starting an academic position at the Department of Archaeology at Durham University. He then moved to Oxford University to become the director of the Paleogenomics and Bioarchaeology Research Network in the School of Archaeology there. Gregor's research work focuses on the use of ancient DNA and paleogenomes to study the pattern and process of animal domestication. His work has been published in high-impact journals such as Science, Nature, and PNAS. And Gregor is really at this stage internationally recognized as a leader in the field of animal domestication studies. Finally, he says he very rarely wonders what his salary would be had he stuck in the oil industry. So thank you very much, Gregor. The title of Gregor's talk today is The Initiation and Consequences of Animal Domestication Through an Evolutionary Lens.
Well, thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be here. Well, actually, I'm just in my office, but it's a real pleasure to be sharing this some stories with you, however virtually this is. It's always, I much prefer having a real live audience, but in lieu of one, was a real thrill to receive your invitation to give this talk, and perhaps I can come to Dublin and do something around this at another time, because this is fun, but it's not quite the same. I wanted to talk to you today about a particular story within domestication that has come out as a result of not just ancient DNA, but specifically genomic studies of ancient DNA, and the resolution that that's afforded us and the sort of insights that it has allowed us to kind of think about regarding questions that we never really would have thought of prior to having access to whole genomes of ancient DNA. So just to start off a little bit more generally, you'll all be familiar with these organisms, generally widely considered domestic. And one reason they're so familiar to you, these and many, many others, are because most of, or at least the vast majority of the 8 billion people on Earth would not be able to subsist, and we certainly wouldn't have the population sizes and the sort of innovations that we've had without having a bedrock of domestic plants and animals, which gives us a real impetus to try and understand their origins and their evolutionary history and how it was that they became so integrated along our own evolutionary history. And there's a lot of questions that people ask about that whole process, one of which is why. And I tend to think that this is not a good question. That presupposes a degree of intentionality that I don't think really exists. It sort of puts us as the decision maker as a species, where we decide that these are the animals that we want and these are the plants that we're going to go domesticate, and we go and we do it. And I'm not sure that that's really an appropriate question. I think a how question is probably a better way to address it, because it gets rid of the assumption that forces us to be on the top of that evolutionary decision-making tree, as it were. However, if we were going to ask why, then I'm sure all of you would agree with me that the Labradoodle is clearly the answer to why people domesticated wolves, because then you could have an organism that looked just like your carpet sort of spring out of it and be just as soft, but a lot more cute. And clearly hunter-gatherers, however many thousands of years ago, when they saw wolves, had this idea that if they selected them or subjected them to a selection pressure for a long enough period of time, that one day we would have labradoodles, and that's why we're all here. And it's a very adaptationist paradigm, I know, but that's, I think, clearly the right answer to it. More appropriately, I think the real answer to all this, although it's a great deal less satisfying, it is probably closer to the truth. And this is just a standard dog that you would get. And I think that it's probably that dogs are more the result of an unintentional long-term byproduct of a shifting relationship between humans and wolves. And how we get into dive into that, the nature of that relationship in terms of the rest of the questions about where this took place, how many times this may have taken place, what the selection pressures were like, and what were the various stages that took place over several thousand years in order to allow us to get to the labradoodle, is a question that we've been now tackling for quite some time. And to that end, we put a paper out a couple of weeks ago in Science, where we looked at a number of ancient genomes as a way to try and get to the heart of some of these questions. And I should say right away, of course, that this was primarily led by a really nice and long-term collaboration between our lab and a handful of other academics, including Pontus Skoglund, Laurent Franz, and Anders Bergström. Three people who you will notice are well known for their bioinformatic and population genomic skills. And if you know anything about population geneticists, is that they all wear blue collared shirts, and when they smile, they're not allowed to show their teeth. So if you are in a department and you have a population geneticist, you will immediately recognize what the primary skill that these three gentlemen bring to the table. So what we did was we combined the resources that we had from our two separate labs, and we ended up with 27 new ancient dog genomes that were, some of which were reasonably well covered. We combined that with 5 previously published ancient genomes, many of which we were involved with as well. And you can get an impression from this slide about the sort of geographic and temporal spread of these samples. Now, a lot of people have asked, they said, oh, well, you've got a lot here from Western Europe, but where are the ones from the UK? Where are the ones from North Africa? Where are the ones from China? Where are the ones from Siberia? And the truth of it is that when in ancient DNA, we are all beggars and not choosers. And in order to get to these 32, we have screened well in excess between our two labs over about 1,500, maybe pushing 2,000 ancient canid remains, from which we have extracted the DNA and then ascertained how much of that DNA is endogenous to dogs or wolves, whichever it was coming from. And from there, decided whether or not it was worth the effort of trying to generate an entire genomic sequence from it through shotgun sequencing. And the answer to that, because it's ancient DNA and it's degraded and it's damaged and there's all kinds of problem with it, is that the vast majority of bones that we get have very little endogenous DNA left of it. And it's only a handful. In this case, what you're seeing is the result of that kind of survivorship bias, if you will, of those samples that yielded sufficient DNA for us to include them in the study. We're working on a great deal more, and we are hoping that those will yield some results, but at least when we closed the data set at 32, this was the geographic and temporal spread that we had. And what I thought I'd do is take you through some of the, at least if not answers, at least ways in which we're now starting to think about some of the bigger questions related to dog domestication as a result of having this new window using these 32 ancient genomes. And the first two that I'd like to address is the question of when. When did this process kickstart, and can we put any sort of bounds on this? And how many times and how many different wolf populations were maybe independently subjected to a kind of selection pressures that have led us to the inevitable labradoodle? So what we were able to do is to generate a phylogeny. And what's nice too about phylogenies from ancient genomes as opposed to mitochondrial genomes is that we can start to think about admixture patterns, and that can sort of lead us back to a perspective about what the most recent common ancestor was, and we can put a molecular clock on this, and it gives us some perspective on the time in which all of these things started to diverge. And what's quite interesting about this is that you can see quite a few of these populations are actually the result of admixture between populations. And that is something that is not just true of dogs, but it's true of a wide variety of different animals, is that as they move around a landscape and they encounter other populations of the same domestic species, or in some cases, wild species that are very closely related, there will be a fair amount of admixture there that will then lead to a population that is a mix or a blend of two separate populations. We see this in our own species, of course, not just within human populations that they move around, but with Neanderthals and Denisovans. And of course, ancient dogs and wolves are no different in this regard. And so what's interesting, though, is that as we're putting this together, the most recent common ancestor for what we're tentatively calling these 5 lineages goes pretty far back into the late Pleistocene, or at least is nowhere close to that late Pleistocene-Holocene boundary, which is not a a terrible surprise, but at least because nobody was really suggesting that dogs were domesticated earlier than 10,000. We have archaeological evidence for dogs at about 15,000. So, but to know that all 5 of these lineages really go back, it looks like a fair ways further back than that, was a pretty interesting result, because it allows us to start focusing in or zeroing in on both a time and a place to try and look for that wolf population that right now is extinct, or it has been extinct for a while, was the one that initially led to dogs. The other interesting thing about this is that this is a tree then, and we can compare the two, that we published on the basis of some ancient DNA that we derived from some pre-contact dogs in the Americas. And you can see here that, again, it sort of recapitulates this idea that there were these 3 general larger scale populations, one of which is a combination of kind of Arctic dogs, very northern latitude dogs, with the dogs that then made it into the Americas, probably with people at about 15,000 years ago or so, and a population of East Asian dogs. And at the bottom of that tree, you can see a population of Western Eurasian dogs that include European, African, and some Indian dogs as well. They were a fair bit later. And these 3 big clusters of dogs it's difficult to really distinguish the relatedness between all 3 of these. You can see the branch lengths at the base of this are very, very short, but each of them have very well supported branch lengths that are going to each zone. So we know that they're units in of themselves, even if we're kind of very much, which is very true of a whole lot of other mammalian and bird taxa and all kinds of things, where the further back you go in the tree, the shorter branch lengths get, and it's sort of reminiscent of maybe a rapid diversification across a landscape, which is hard then to discriminate between different when and how and where these things might have happened. But at least we know that we have these 3 large groups and maybe these 5 separate lineages that occupy very large areas of both the North America and all of Europe and Eurasia generally. What's true of also with this, if you look at this tree, is that it does go back to a single point here, which is where New Guinea singing dogs join everything else, modern New Guinea singing dogs. And this is consistent with a dog origin from a single population of wolves. And what's interesting about that, now we're saying that also, is that when we say consistent, we're being very careful about the wording with that, because there are still, because we only have 32 of these thus far, there are still populations of, say, Mesolithic dogs from Europe, from which we have no genomic coverage. We still have populations in China for which that are very old, which we don't have any really strong genomic coverage from. So there are still unsampled regions of Eurasia, especially going further back in time, that if we were to get those, then we could make a much more confident statement of saying that it was only 1 or possibly more than 1. But right now, what we can say for sure is that if there was more than 1, then those other populations have not contributed significantly to modern populations, which is different than saying there was just 1, but at least that's kind of moving in that direction. One other thing that we can do with genomes is that we can look at this population history through time and space, which is also a very powerful way of doing it. Because again, if we just look at mitochondria, which has its own benefits, and I am a big proponent of mitochondria, it is a single non-recombining locus, which has its upsides. The downside, though, is that you cannot look at populations that have been admixing through time and space and trying to work out how all these populations were moving around. And of course, the way that we do this, and you'll see this in every ancient genomic paper and probably most modern ones as well, is we do this with a PCA. It's a pretty straightforward approach. And what we can infer from this is that the extremes of the PCA, and in this case, what's on the bottom right and on the top left, gives us an appreciation for just how widely disparate these populations are in terms of their overall ancestral patterns and their population relatedness. So what we see here on this tree is that, or on the PCA rather, is that on that top left you have ancient Near Eastern dogs, and the bottom right you have the East Asian, sort of northern latitude, and dogs that were in the Americas, but came over with the first people who arrived there. And in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got ancient and modern European dogs. Now, what's interesting about this is that you would think that if the population differentiation was solely dictated by geographic distance or separation between the two, then you should get East Asia on one side, maybe Portugal on the other side. Instead, what it appears is that you've got Near East and East Asia, which then suggests that really, and we've done some other analysis on this too, is that all European dogs, again, ancient and modern, are the result of admixture between these two different lineages, the ancient Near Eastern and the Siberian North American. Now, we have trouble explaining this from an archaeological or anthropological perspective, but at least genomically, this is the pattern that seems to be taking shape. Although again, it will be very important to get these ancient genomes from the very old European dogs, of which we know there's at least one at 15,000, and there's several other in that area which have claimed to be dogs. And we have, though we have some mitochondria from those dogs, none of them have the sufficient preservation for us to really be able to interrogate them from the genomic perspective. But that's coming. We're working on it. The other interesting thing is that if you look at the PCA, what we find is that there is a significant amount of variation that's been lost. So in that dotted oval there, what you'll see is those are everything that's grayed out here is an ancient dog. And that means a lot of this PCA space is being taken up by dog lineages that no longer exist. In fact, all the extremes of this PCA are dogs that no longer exist. And when we look at this, this little cluster here, this is all modern European dogs, which is, I find that fascinating, because especially when we think about the history of breed dogs, and when the whole concept of breeding dogs towards an aesthetic and using pedigrees to make those decisions, where we kind of bind them off into separate groups where we're not allowing them to intermix, and we start breeding toward more extremes of the phenotypes, we have a phenomenal range of phenotypic and morphological variability within these dogs, everything from a Chihuahua to a Great Dane, in between, and probably others as well, all being pulled out of a very, very tiny little portion of the overall genomic variability that we see across the entire PCA. So again, you imagine the huge variability there, and then this entire batch here is just as ancient dogs that have no history, or certainly didn't contribute to any of the modern breeds that we're used to seeing walking down the street, much less the Labradoodle that's probably sitting on your couch right now. So what this suggests, of course, is that, and this is another very good reason for looking at the ancient DNA, not just of dogs, but lots of other domestic animals, is that we know for sure that the original wolf lineage that led to dogs is extinct, as well as numerous dog lineages, some of which were still around about 500 or 1,000 years ago. So being able to once you look just at modern populations, you are only, no matter how deeply you sequence the genomes of every dog that's currently on the planet, you were still only going to be able to recover a very tiny percentage of dogs that were around, say, 1,000 years ago, much less 10,000 or even 15 or 1,000 years or older. And that is really telling, because what that's and is the pattern that we're seeing in all kinds of different animals, and perhaps not a terrible surprise, and maybe even a little bit depressing. But what it is saying is that the more that we are interrogating the archaeological record, and just everything that we find is going to be new, it's going to occupy something else, and it's going to tell us a completely different story, because it's a door that we can't possibly open by looking at modern populations. So the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about, and I wanted to get a little bit more into detail about this, is this role of admixture. And again, if we come back to this opening slide where I was saying that these are all animals that are at the foundation of modern societies, and without them, we don't have electricity, we don't have money, we don't have massive trade networks, we don't have anything that we normally associate with or characterize the current human presence on Earth, even if it occupies a very small proportion of the total evolutionary time that humans have been around. Every single one of the organisms that you're looking at here has experienced some degree, in some cases significant degree, of gene flow with either other domestic populations or wild ones. So if we start thinking about dogs and wolves within the context of all of these different animals, we start to see a pretty interesting pattern. So we'll start with one direction. We'll start with dogs to wolves, assuming that they are two very different things, although yes, dogs derive from wolves, but once you establish those two separate populations, you can then see them, how distinguished they are at a genomic level, and you can start to infer patterns of admixture. Well, there's a really cool paper out relatively recently which looked at this black melanistic wolf population that's in North America. And Bob Wayne and Kirk Lohmiller and a few other people started looking at the genomes of these wolves, these black color morphs, because what they've been able to say is that in some cases, these black color morphs have risen in frequency and appear to be positively selected. Now, what's interesting is that once you get drilled down into the genomes of these, the color morph gene that is causing this black phenotype doesn't look like it is segregating within wolf populations. In fact, it looks much more like it's coming from dogs. So what they concluded was that, and I'll read this off for you, is that a selective sweep of the black haplotype across North America, and only North America, which is curious, this single adaptive integration from dogs into wolves, and they put this ridiculously precise date of 1598 to 7248, which, you know, I don't know if it was on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, but you get the point. Suggesting that there was integration with early Native American dogs, which we now know genomically, because we have the genomes of them, were really distinct from all of those that were in Eurasia, then into that black color morph. And this would have taken place, it could easily 10,000 years or so after they arrived in North America, which is really pretty interesting. So we have, I know some of these things are a little bit sketchy, and there's some other people who think that maybe this was standing genetic variation within those wolves, but you know, there's arguments on both sides of that. But I think that there's certainly a strong suggestion here that this was integration from dog into wolf. When we start looking the other way, there are plenty of ethnographic and historic examples of people discussing the nature, the frequency, and the kind of efficacy of whether it's a good idea to grab a wolf from your local environment and breed it into your dog population. And there are, I was just reading this morning, a range of reports, historical reports of people talking to, say, Greenlanders and their sled dogs about whether or not it's a good idea to do so. And some people say it's a very good idea. Other people say it's the worst idea possible because a dog that is the result of a wolf and the mating between a wolf and a dog, it does not make a very good sled dog at all for a whole range of different reasons. This particular photograph was taken and sits in an ethnographic museum in Kazakhstan. And there's the Kazakh on the left and the Russian on the right, which says na khotya, which means on the hunt. And it's taken of two Kazakh hunters, and what they're holding, you can say, are two wolf puppies that they have captured with apparently the intention of breeding them with their dogs, which are back at the camp, in order to introduce some wolfiness into their dog populations, which, you know, is kind of an interesting idea. And you can see how intuitively maybe that's a good idea if you're talking about small population sizes and there's a lot of inbreeding and perhaps you want to increase some sort of ferocity or whatever else is associated with wolves. However biologically relevant it is, maybe culturally it's got some significance. And so there is certainly this sort of thing that's been happening. And we can see elements of this in Kamchatka and the New World, certainly in America and Canada and Greenland and lots of other places. So if we start thinking about other animals and the degree to which this introgression has taken place into the genomes, when we're thinking specifically about the domestic population and the wild one, we put a paper out last year, which was a huge collaboration with lots and lots of different people. If you start counting from the beginning, you'll get to 100 before you get to my name at the very end, which was a lot of fun. It was sometimes not the easiest thing in the world to coordinate all these people, but everybody contributed in a meaningful way. And it was only through that contribution that we were able to try and understand what was happening when we looked at the long-term time and space population genomics of domestic pigs and wild boar in Eurasia. And what we found was that, again on a PCA, that there are these Near Eastern wild boar that are at the top left of your PCA there, and we have European wild boar on the bottom. There are some modern European domestics there on the right, that are grayed out area. Most of that is being pulled right because of relatively recent introgression with Chinese pigs, which is a whole separate story because pigs are coming from two separate populations of wild boar, which sort of leads us to think that maybe the same thing was happening with dogs and wolves. But in this case, if we focus solely on Eurasia, you can see this pretty big gap, certainly along PC2, between the Near Eastern wild boar, from which early domestic pigs were derived in Eurasia, and then the European wild boar on the left. Now, what's interesting is that when you start going through time and we start generating genomes of pigs that were in Europe but spaced out temporally, so we start looking at European pigs from 7,100 to 6,000, and then again a little bit closer in time between 6,700 and more and 900 BP, you can see this shifting down. And what's really kind of fun about this, and when we see this both at the mitochondrial and at the nuclear level, what it appears is happening is that pigs are domesticated in the Near East, in Anatolia. They move into Europe alongside farmers and an entire Neolithic, for want of a better word, package. And as they do so, they start integrating with and having gene flow, experiencing gene flow with populations of wild boar that are in Europe that are genetically distinguished from their cousins that are the Near Eastern wild boar that are in Anatolia. There's a big biogeographical divide right at the Bosporus that takes that is true for a whole wide range of different, both wild and domestic taxa. So initially, as those pigs come in, they start to slowly take on the genomic appearance of the European wild boar, with which they are now mating, as opposed to the Near Eastern ones, which now they've left behind or are still in Anatolia. And then through time, the genomic patterns start shifting to be increasingly looking like European wild boar, while still maintaining their distinctiveness as genomically and morphologically and behaviorally domestic pigs within archaeological sites, which is pretty interesting. So we see exactly the same thing at the mitochondrial level. At 8,000 years ago, when the first pigs arrived, you can see those are all yellow. By 3,000 years later, every domestic pig we have turns red. So it's over a 3,000 year period when the entire mitochondrial and nuclear genomic composition of domestic pigs takes on the complete appearance of European wild boar, despite the fact that domestic pigs were never independently domesticated from the European wild boar. It was simply through a long-term pattern of pretty strict admixture. So in this case, these pigs really are not so much pigs as they are chameleons. And the way to think about this is that if you have a chameleon on a yellow background, which is the Near Eastern wild boar background, and then you move it into Europe, what happens is that relatively slowly, those chameleons will then take on the appearance of their background, which in this case is a European wild boar. It becomes red. And so that suggests, and so we find this absolutely fascinating, because that means it was basically a complete turnover in these genomes, with one or two small exceptions around coat color, where we see a black color morph of pigs very early on in the Neolithic in the Near East, and that maintains its, that's preserved and maintains its integrity after being moved into Europe, despite the fact that there's a lot of gene flow that would be otherwise, excuse me, swamping it out. So that means if we're thinking about a scale of things here, 100% of pig genomes are now made up of European wild boar. And with that, well now, so of course, with the integration of Chinese pigs over the last 150 years, that's shifted a bit too, but that's just more signature of admixture. But what that suggests is that pigs are very happy. There's no barriers to entry here. Pigs are very happy to take on the genomic appearance of whatever wild population they are currently residing in, and there doesn't seem to be any downside to that. And there's certainly no selection against it. So if we move to chickens, this is another paper that I was lucky enough to be involved with that came out earlier this year, 863 nuclear genomes. Now what's curious about this, there's no ancient genomes in this, it's all modern genomes, but it's modern genomes that are representative of all the different Gallus, there's 4 Gallus species, as well as the 5 separate subspecies of red jungle fowl. And to give you an impression, this is the general geographic distribution of those 5 different subspecies. And what was fascinating about this is that getting multiple genomes, high coverage genomes of chickens across this entire region representing all these different ones, you put that into a straight phylogeny, and what you can find is that just about all of them sit basally to domestic chickens, with the single exception of Spadiceus, which is located in sort of northern Thailand, southern China, that general region there. It kind of fits into some archaeological evidence for chicken domestication as well. But what's curious is that, so this paper was able to identify the specific subspecies of red jungle fowl from which chickens were initially derived. And then by using, again, the D statistics and ABABABA and a whole series of other ways to measure admixture, by looking at all the rest of those subspecies, again, from which chickens were not initially derived, but having moved into the territories where those wild red jungle fowl subspecies existed, they started taking on the genomic appearance of those subspecies. And equally, when they moved to Ceylon, or they moved to Java, where you have, and South Asia, where you have the populations of the other wild Gallus species, including Lafayette, Sonorati, and the green jungle fowl in Java, there is some evidence that those wild species are also contributing to the genomes of domestic chickens that were brought there. So if we put chickens on this graph, we now have genetic chickens receiving as much as 22% of their genomes from local subspecies of chickens, and as high as 2% of their genomes from things like the gray jungle fowl Sonorati in South Asia. So this is relatively permeable, but not quite to the same degree of pigs where they're taking on 100% of the genome all the way through. And then we move a little bit left again, and this is a fabulous study that David will know well, of course, being last author on this paper. And by sequencing the genome of this extinct Eurasian aurochs from the UK, and by looking at the patterns of integration from that aurochs into populations of cattle across Scotland, England, and of course the rest of Europe as well, the quote from this is that certainly British and Irish breeds, although some of the others as well, have genetic variants with the ancient auroch specimen, which was around at a time when there were no domestic cows at all anywhere near the UK. And the results that they demonstrated supported localized gene flow from aurochs into the ancestors of modern British Irish cattle. I had to dig deep. They didn't put any numbers on this, David, in the main paper, which was frustrating. So I had to go deep dive into the supplement. And it turns out that certainly within the UK, the average is somewhere 15, 16%, something like that, which is not a small amount when you consider that there are cows in the UK that have absorbed a portion of the genome of a local aurochs, which again was never domesticated, had nothing to do with domestication, but it was simply through gene flow, which makes you think about the ways in which people are managing these different animals and how important it is to either prevent or encourage gene flow with the wild animals that were around that had just, suddenly there's domestic versions of them on the landscape, but that doesn't make them any less attractive. Lastly then, thinking about dogs and wolves. Well, so there's this paper that came out a couple of years ago. There's another paper that did something similar where they looked at this, they looked at dogs and wolves from the Tibetan Plateau. And to survive, which is something like 4,000 meters, to survive up on that high of an altitude, it's a very good idea to have a version of this gene called EPAS1, which allows you to have greater levels of oxygen in your bloodstream than most of us who exist pretty close to sea level. Now, there's been a really brilliant demonstration of this in humans, where it looks like the humans who are living at very high altitudes on this Tibetan plateau have a version of EPAS1, which you don't see in other people, but you do see in Denisovans. So again, what this looks like is an admixture between humans and Denisovans, and then a positive selective pressure placed on this newly acquired locus, which allowed people to live at very high altitudes. What's fascinating about this paper is that they showed exactly the same thing in Tibetan gray wolves and Tibetan dogs, so that the dogs basically look like dogs from everywhere else, except at this EPAS1 version, which you can see here on the figure, where there appears to be not just a sign of admixture, but a sign of reasonably high selective pressure, allowing the dogs to exist at very high altitudes. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the rest of the genome of dogs, you don't see that. There isn't much in the way of any evidence that any other element of Tibetan wolves or wolves in general is anywhere near it. So it's almost like they had the admixture, they selected this gene, but everything else around it got purged, which led the authors of the paper to say that after admixture of the ancestral breed of Highland dogs and wolves, most of the DNA from wolves was lost during the breeding of Highland dogs, and only the DNA that benefited their lives on the Highland was preserved. So there are some population geneticists who wear blue shirts and don't show their teeth when they smile that I've talked to, and I don't have the expertise to say one way or the other, but they are suggesting that maybe this isn't so clear-cut, that perhaps this was standing variation that happened to be in these dogs that was selected, and therefore obviating the need or the necessity for having any kind of admixture between the wolves that were on the high altitude plain and dogs. So it's a little bit of an open question, but at least it's curious that this is certainly a possibility. In our paper, what was really kind of fun was that by looking not just at modern dogs, but by being able to go back 11,000 years, that's the oldest ancient dog that we've got a genome for, we could then look at, and we've got tons of ancient wolves as well, which is a forthcoming publication. We were looking then for the same signatures of admixture. And what we were able to see was that actually there are no populations of wolves, ancient or modern, that are any more closely related to any population of dogs anywhere. So what we're suggesting from this is that the gene flow has been unidirectional from dogs into wolf populations, and that our results suggest that, and this is the key phrase here, admixture from wolves into dogs has been so limited as to be undetectable, even at the level of a very high coverage genome, which is just fascinating to me, because what that suggests is that we have the real span. We span the gamut in just a handful of domestic animals, where we have pigs at 100%, very happy to take on the entire genome of a population from which they were not derived. Chickens kind of hanging out in the 20s, maybe a little bit less than that. Cows taking on 15% of their genome, and your Labradoodle has exactly 0% of any wolf in it, which, I don't know, this starts to get kind of interesting. Is that what is this really saying? And I think what this is forcing us to do is to consider these animals not just as kind of independent biological units of things that are maybe reasonably closely associated with people around a landscape, but more, it's forcing us, and I think this is a very good thing, to think about the relationship that we have with these animals. And we have lots of good ethnographic evidence of the way in which people manage pigs. Actually, for a lot of populations, especially on Sardinia and Corsica and places where people do things in a way that might mimic what was happening in the medieval era and perhaps even earlier, having pigs doesn't mean having pigs. It doesn't mean in the way that you think of Danish pigs in crates and not being able to move. Having pigs in these areas means that you might only see them for a couple weeks a year, but generally speaking, they're out, and then they come back for overwinter foddering or for birthing or for any number of other things. So that relationship between people and those pigs is a lot more diffuse, and that's more extensive management, which then allows gene flow to permeate into these big genes, into these pig genomes much more readily with far fewer consequences. Whereas if you are a dog, what this is suggesting is that very few people will tolerate any wolfiness whatsoever in their dogs. In other words, hybrids between dogs and wolves do not make very good dogs and do not make very good wolves. Now, the question about this then is what does that mean for this? If this is an ethnographic example of precisely what we're describing doesn't happening, why are we not seeing the evidence of this behavior in the genomes themselves? Is this something and is that telling us even more? Are we asking the wrong questions here? Is this more about something to do with the cultural aspect of it that might not necessarily be the way that we imbue meaning and importance into what is necessarily a good dog or a bad wolf or anything in between? The other thing is, this is a paper out like a week or two ago, where a whole genome analysis of wolves in Fenno-Scandinavia found zero evidence of dog integration into their wolf populations, which seems contradictory to what we're finding just on the opposite side of the world in North America, where some integration from dogs into wolves has proved very important for those wolves when they've got these black coat colors. So I don't know. I think what's really fun about this is that it's giving us this picture of everything, but it's making us really start to consider the animals as individuals and really start to think what the important questions are, which is, what were these relationships like? How different are they now? And how do you, if it's 0% dog with any wolfiness in it, how do you get from wolf to dog? And you have to go through some valley of a selection landscape, because half a dog is no good, but in order to get to a dog which is any good, you have to go somewhat away from wolves, because wolves are no good at being dogs either. And what does that mean about the origins of dogs? And I'm asking questions now instead of giving you answers, which is perhaps not the best way to end a talk. But I feel like there are some important take-home messages here. Firstly, dogs are clearly first. We know this from a whole variety of other evidence. We're now looking at something maybe in the early 20s of thousands of years ago, which is even earlier than I would have gone relatively recently. Dogs are then not just first, but then weird. They don't do the same kinds of things that all other domestic animals do in terms of the incorporation of genomes from other domestic and wild populations. And that's leading us, of course, like all good research, to a lot more questions than answers. But I feel like at least we're getting a much more sophisticated appreciation of the time and space of dog domestication in relationship to the rest of domestication, and really thinking about what our role is as people in these relationships and how that's changed us as much as it's changed them. So I'll leave it with that, and I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, that was great, Gregor. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating stuff. So just to make it clear, we now have time for questions and answers from the audience. For those of you watching remotely, you can post questions using the Q&A facility in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. And my co-chair today is Professor Emmeline Hill from the UCD School of Agriculture and Food Science. So we'll be sort of transmitting your questions, your text questions to Gregor verbally so everyone else can hear them. So I'm just going to look to see if we have any questions in the Q&A. Okay, so Alex Evans, actually head of our school, has a question about domestic cats. So he's saying, fascinating, great talk, Gregor. Any thoughts or evidence on domestic cats as to where they fit into your theory about domestication and the origin of domestic animals in general?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for asking that question. If you'd asked me that 18 months ago, I just would have shrugged and been like, oh, well, who knows about cats? Nothing. It turns out that one of my PhD students is just wrapping up a study where we have about 15 genomes of ancient cats. And we are just exploring that data now and looking at it. And what's really fun for me about what's coming out from this is that it looks as though there is, and again, this is all very preliminary and it could probably change in the next few hours, but it looks as though there are, certainly within the UK, there are wild cats in the UK that are very clearly wild and look very much like Sylvestris. And then when Libica domestic cats get introduced to the UK, there is a slight suggestion that there's some admixture, but for the most part, they are completely distinct, very much like dogs and wolves. They're hanging out in their own size of the PCA. Now, what's fascinating is working with Helen Sen up in Edinburgh. What she has demonstrated from collections of both wild cats and kind of roadkill cats, some of which may be domestic, is that over the last 100 or so years, you have a pretty substantial, what they're calling a hybrid swarm, where that entire PCA, rather than occupying the two extremes, is now being filled in, and you're getting a significant amount of a population which has now got elements of both domestic cats and wild Sylvestris that were in Scotland, all blending together. So this is another really cool story, which is very different than what we're seeing in other places, where when you think about the way in which a lot of other domestic animals, when I mentioned those pigs at 100%, what's very true though is that Danish pig behind the bars that I was telling you about, there is certainly a trend with the more intensive that relationship between humans and pigs, and the more we're reliant upon them and see them as production animals, the less we're allowing them to accidentally or otherwise mate with wild boar. So we're kind of severing that, slowly severing that gene flow. What looks like what's happening in cows is that actually that's changing. There was these two discrete entities between wild and domestic cats that was being maintained. But over the last 100 years, those floodgates have now opened and you get a huge amount of gene flow between those two populations. And so again, I think that's telling us something about either proximity or human density, or the way in which these wild cats are learning to subsist in closer to human niches or even within human niches, and what the opportunities that might afford for gene flow with domestic cats, which again are also allowed to go out. So I'm sure there's some really interesting stuff going on there, but again, cats seem to be doing something completely different on their own as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gregor. So Emmeline, we don't have the questions coming through the chat at the moment. Do you maybe have a question for Gregor?
I have absolutely tons of questions.
Yay!
Gregor, I could talk all day. That was really fascinating. Thanks so much.
Sure.
My first question actually is, what are the implications of all of these studies, not just on dogs, but all domestic animals, on the conservation of domestic animal diversity? In the dog PCA plot, you showed us that there's, the common breed dogs are very tightly clustered. And then there are some Asian and African dogs that are more separate to that. We've lost a lot of the genetic diversity. What does that tell us about what we need to do in terms of conserving genetic diversity? And I suppose in that, thinking about maybe ancestral contributions as well, I suppose my main interest is in horses, and the recent archaeological data on horses has really turned our understanding of horse domestication upside down. It's not something that you talked about, but that the Chisvalsky horses are likely to have been feral that were already domesticated at Botai. I'm talking about that because some of my students might be, hopefully are here as participants, and they're aware of that. So there's conservation questions now about the Chisvalsky horse. So just in general, what do these studies mean in terms of our conserving domestic animal diversity now?
That's a great question. And if you have another spot available in this, I would highly recommend getting Ludovic Orlando to come and tell you. I was just on the phone with him last week, and he's got a whole new horse story, which is absolutely blowing my mind. So there's continue to be those phenomenal revelations by looking at ancient genomes. And he's got at least an order of magnitude more, if not more than that, 2 orders of magnitude more ancient horses than we have any other animal. So yeah, the horse story is just absolutely fascinating. And I think that's also showing a similar thing where you get a winnowing of the total genomic variation. And certainly on horses, you get a winnowing of the Y chromosome variation as people go more towards studs. But that's only true in the last couple hundred years. That was not true. And so if you only look at modern populations, you think, oh, well, people were selecting males for a long time. No, it's a very recent phenomenon. One thing that we're trying to explore is by looking at breed dogs over the last, say, 100, 120, 130 years. And by getting genomes of museum specimens of these kind of early variants of these domestic breeds, which again, there was a shift in the way they were selected because of to a phenotype, to an aesthetic, and predicated on having a pedigree where you knew what the relatedness was between everything. There are a whole bunch of breeds of dog, and I'm sure this must be true in horses as well. I'm thinking of like night blindness and things where you get specific breeds that are very heavily prone to genetic diseases. And yeah, it's great when you can hive off a breed and you create this kind of uniform thing, which everybody knows generally what you're going to get phenotypically. But if that is now very prone to any number of, like, say, hip dysplasia or predication to any particular other communicable diseases, then that's clearly a bad thing. And that means that the long-term survivability of that unit, however you've bounded it, is probably not great. And so, I mean, everybody on this chat probably knows about this. So one thing that would be kind of fun is to go back and look at the genomes of some of these early breed horses or dogs or whatever else and see what the total genomic variability was. And were they just as susceptible as we can infer from their genomic patterns as modern populations? Or has there been such a winnowing just in the last 100 years of these breed populations that has made them more so? And if that's the case, then we can certainly mitigate that. I'm not sure if we could like sort of CRISPR into a dachshund something to make it less prone to hip dysplasia, but there are at least ways to start to think about that, because at least we would know what the total amount of genomic variability and how likely it was that these early breeds variants would be suffering from these kinds of things. So yeah, there's certainly a role to play. And the more you look back in time, the more you can understand the evolution of these things rather than thinking of this fixed populations right now.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks,
David.
Thanks, Gregor. I'm just seeing 2 questions coming up on the Q&A facility. The first question is from Michael Dover, who's an alumnus of the animal science program in the school. Gregor, is there any evidence for dog population genetic patterns mimicking human mass migration, replacement, turnover, etc. post-domestication? Does it, I suppose, do dogs mirror the patterns of movements of humans at a genetic level?
Again, it's almost like I planted people in the audience to ask me these questions. Thank you so much for asking that, because it allows me to talk about something that isn't in this talk that I'm absolutely fascinated by. The short answer is yes. The long answer is even more interesting, which is that it's not just at the genomic level, it's at all kinds of other levels as well. So when we think about So one thing to think about genomic level, and we do a bit of this in the paper as well, is that if you look at the phylogeny of dogs and you try and use that phylogeny based upon the geographic and temporal context from which the samples were derived, and you get human samples from those same geographic and temporal samples, and you try and fit the dog tree onto the human DNA and vice versa, the trees work like 95% of the time. And what's brilliant about that is that what it's really showing is that for as long as people have had dogs, these dogs have mattered to them. They fit within their human cultures. And when they move, the dogs move with them. And they're very much partners in crime. But it's not just at the genomic level. We start looking at a bunch of other things too. When we look at the isotope values in the UK through time, when human as a measure of the protein component of diets, that as people start having higher protein diets, their dogs do as well. And as people stop doing that, their dogs do as well. So it's like the way in which the dog and human dietary components have shifted through time mirrors itself. And what's also, in more of a tragic side of things, when we look at the dogs from North America, there's probably hundreds of thousands or millions of dogs in North America, very much like the people all the way up until 1492. All the genomic evidence and archaeological evidence and anthropological evidence suggests that as Europeans arrive, the human population gets smashed to like 96%, leaving only a very small fraction of what was there prior to the arrival of Europeans, communicable diseases, all kinds of other rationales for this. Guess what? The dogs do exactly the same thing. You had a unique population of dogs in North America. And again, either through disease or through just simply not being culturally not fitting in, or because the new ones were superior in one way or another, it looks as though the dog population went through almost the exact same, if not a greater degree of persecution. And now what's left in North America is just a tiny little fraction of mitochondria and nuclear signatures of that original population. So as soon as humans and dogs get together, it doesn't matter what metric you're using, what kind of analysis, what sort of archaeological science technique, whatever you're finding is true of humans is going to be almost, you can bet now that what you're finding in people is going to be exactly what you find in those dogs.
Thanks, Gregor, for answering that. We have another question that's come in on our Q&A, and please, everybody, if you have any questions, please add them onto the Q&A field. So there's a question here from Joanna Brook, and she's wondering if the high level of admixture that you've shown between the domestic pig and wild boar, does this have implications for particular behavioral traits in the resulting domestic populations?
Yeah, brilliant question. And that's one thing that as we move forward with the technology and grant funding, hopefully, the more that we can get higher coverage genomes, the more work that goes into GWAS and other association studies that allow us to try and pinpoint the genetic variants that are not deterministic, but at least suggestive of certain behavioral traits and certain functional traits, the more that we can query those traits in the ancient pigs, allowing us to try and get an entire picture of not just what they look like, but what their behavior was like. What we can say by proxy, looking at the archaeological evidence, is that despite all of this rampant gene flow and despite this turnover that took place over about 3,000 years, that pigs continue to be found in archaeological sites. They continue to be smaller than wild boar, and they continue to harbor all of the signatures that you associate with domestic pigs. So there wasn't so much of a behavioral shift that was having an effect on the way in which we interpret archaeologically the presence of domestic pigs in these sites as part of the zooarchaeological context in which these sites or these animals were found. So it certainly seems to suggest that despite the gene flow, it's not having so much of an effect on the behavior of the pigs that's altering the way in which they're hanging out with people and that the way that people are dealing with them. So it's kind of maybe a slowly thing. I mean, I know there's that whole idea that if you put a frog into a boiling pan and heat it up very slowly, that it won't jump out, which turns out is not true at all. But maybe the kind of generally perceived notion that it is true is at work here, where if you have 3,000 years to incorporate a genome, maybe there's other ways to mitigate that gene flow, that swamping of your genome to maintain your integrity as a domestic pig that involve other elements of metagenomic processes, or maybe the relationship between genes and phenotype is not as strong as we would like to think.
Thanks, Gregor. Can I follow up on the, I suppose, the behavior theme? Something that was found again in horses in Ludovic Orlando's group was that there's there was an enrichment for genes with an involvement with neurobiological functions in the domestic populations when he compared domestic horses to the wild populations. And something that you've written quite a bit about is the domestication syndrome and the commonalities of, I suppose, traits among domestic animals that may stem from neural crest cells. Can you comment on that at all, and what the implications might be if to that idea or that hypothesis, if we're seeing genes that may have some neurobiological function being selected in horses, and I believe in dogs as well. Maybe that's something. I think I read something about that.
Yeah, so Eleanor Carlson and Catherine Lord and I put a paper out earlier this year in Tree, just saying that the story is just a little bit too neat, and I don't want to say too cute because that sounds like I'm disparaging it, but what I mean is too easily swallowed. Like it makes.
Sorry to cut across you, Gregor. Maybe you might explain to the audience where it comes from. It comes from the fox experiment.
Yeah, so there was, it's a classic and very important experiment ongoing that looked at foxes that were initially bred for their fur, that were then moved to Siberia, and Belayev initiated this experiment because he felt that there was a thing called the domestication syndrome. It was a term originally taken from plants to mean a suite of characteristics that differentiate domestic populations from wild ones, and that we see intuitively, we see this with animals. You don't see wild animals with piebald coats, but you do see domestic ones, and you see them across a whole suite of domestic animals that don't have a very recent common ancestry, which suggests that it's the process of domestication itself that is leading to similar phenotypic results. And these different characteristics are therefore called the syndrome. Now, and what people were seeing with the wolves, with these foxes, is that they were breeding them in two separate categories. One in which they were selecting for what they called the tame ones, where if you put your hand into a cage, it would react in a very curious, almost passive manner, and it would just sort of come up and be happy about the presence of human hands. Another population, which they, I think in the literature is often described as aggressive, but that's a bit of a misnomer, pointed out by some behaviorists to me, some people working on the ethology of these things, where if you have an animal that has a very strong fight or flight reaction, when you put your hand in the cage, it has nowhere to go. This is not aggression, this is fear. And those are two very different things in the way that we describe them and what's actually underlying this whole thing. It allows us to think about it in a different way as well. So there were foxes that were very fearful, and those that had a great deal less fear and a lot more curious. And they selected them with only 10% of the most extreme examples of those two characteristics were allowed to reproduce to the next generation. And in those populations, what they started to see was shifts in the phenotypes of the more tame foxes, upturned tails, barking, floppy ears, even little white patches, that suggested that these were then emergent out of a selection for a behavior rather than for these traits themselves. So the paper that we then wrote simply suggested that actually, if you look at the population from which these foxes were derived, it had been through two significant bottlenecks and before it even arrived, so much so that when you look at the total genomic variability of the foxes, it's no different than most modern dog breeds, which, as we know, is a ridiculously tiny proportion of what is ordinarily within any wild or even domestic population for matter that isn't a breed. So what hasn't been done is a demonstration that these things are resulting not from the selection, but simply from associations within a genome that are allowing these traits to express themselves because of significant amounts of inbreeding. And the correlation between the two is not always terribly strong. Not only that, but there's some suggestion these traits were also appearing in those more fearful populations. And also the suggestion that these were there before they started doing the selection. So all we were saying in the initial paper was that, there is a lot of people see this thing called the domestication syndrome, think of it as real, and then fit evidence into it without ever testing it to begin with. And we were like, it may very well be real. In fact, I really hope it is. But right now, it's predicated more upon an assumption of its truth rather than the tested empirical evidence that it is substantiated from an actual statistical, meaningful measure of it. So we followed that up because we got a whole bunch of letters kind of not super thrilled with what we were saying. So there's been 3 now published in Tree. The most recent of which was just published, I think, last month, where Dominic Wright, who's a good friend and colleague in Sweden, wrote and said, well, surely there are some things that we can take as read within domestic population, and one of them is brain size. And all domestic populations have smaller brains than wild ones. It's like, well, yeah, they do until you actually look at the evidence for it. And the greatest thing for me was that the evidence for it in horses was that they took domestic horse brains, they measured the size against not wild ones, but Przewalski's horses, which you've already described, are not wild in any sense. In fact, the modern Przewalski's horse population is heavily inbred, is very heavily managed, and is most likely the feral descendants of the first domestic population. So in what way is this an apt comparison between wild and domestic? It's not. In which case, those numbers become irrelevant, really. The other thing is that within dogs, it's not true. It depends on the size of the dog. When you look at very big dogs, it is true. But when you look at medium-sized dogs, they do not have smaller brains than any wolf population. And oh, by the way, the wolf population that gave rise to dogs is now extinct, so what comparison are you making? So we were just saying, look, these things that we all take for granted, that are just out there in the literature and have been reified time and time again with citations, just fail that first hurdle of actually being real demonstrable scientific evidence. And until we have that, my jury's out on a lot of these things.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Gregor. We can talk about that again. I tend to agree with you, but I think the neural crest thing is potentially interesting, but I think you're right. The evidence isn't there yet. So
the other thing about the neural crest real quickly is that just because you find a signature with something to do with neural crest is doing everything. So until you have that comparative other population and show that it's not there, like how it's just too easy. It's almost like looking under the streetlight for your keys, right? In what population have you not found neural crest, and where would you not expect it? Just because you see it right there, you find your keys under the streetlight, doesn't mean that that's where you lost them, right? It's I don't know. There's just some bigger questions about that. And it's just for me, it's just too easily a knee-jerk thing. It's like we found it, so therefore it is. Bugs me.
Oh, okay. No, that we still have a little bit more time. I just need to highlight that the system will shut down at 10 minutes past 2. So we have 2 more questions, and we probably need to finish then. So the first question is from Holly English. And she has a very interesting question about dingoes, the Australian wild dogs, which are viewed by some as a key facet of Australian wildlife, while others consider them feral dogs requiring population control. So she was wondering what you think about this, and really, I suppose, in some that may have something to do with the origin of dingoes as well.
Sure. No, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. There are these long-running debates. And I think what here is, it's important to consider that our relationship with animals is not just its genomic history, that there are a lot of other factors that go into this, including the functional way in which these animals exist within their environments, as well as our shifting relationship with them as well. So things are good or bad depending on how we view them. And that can completely override whatever its genomic evolutionary history is. What is clear about dingoes is a couple things. One, they are dogs. Or at least genomically, they are dogs. We have all of the mitochondrial and genomic evidence. We know which population they were coming from. They're very closely related to New Guinea singing dogs. It was clearly people moving from South Asia into island Southeast Asia, then to Australia, that brought these dogs with them. And they only arrive in Australia 3,500 years ago. There's nothing, there's no deeper history to dingoes in Australia prior to that. Now, what's curious to me about dingoes is that having arrived and having sort of left the yoke of the humans with which they arrived, they were able to occupy a niche on a landscape that may have been formerly occupied by thylacines or any number of other extinct organisms in Australia. And my understanding is that for many of those populations, they are not reliant on humans, that they are able to exist as wild animals that are not either magnetically pulled into or repulsed by a human niche, and they're not requiring, say, trash dumps or anything else in order to subsist in the way that many wild dog populations in India still do require those human mechanisms in order to keep those populations going. So what it comes down to then is that given its genomic history, that's not necessarily going to tell you anything. And also given its archaeological history, all of those are nice bits and pieces, but it's still a cognitive exercise on the part of people as to whether or not we consider them to be very important to that landscape or not important to that landscape. And that's going to rest upon a whole series of other assumptions and arguments that can be made around ecology and environments and functional roles versus evolutionary roles and all kinds of other stuff. So, and I don't have a horse in that race at all, but I am aware of what the history of dingoes is, and to think of them as a completely separate species that ignores its ultimate origin from dogs is for me a bit short-sighted. Now, what you do with that information is on you, but that's where they're coming from.
Okay, great, thanks, Gregor. So I think we just have time for this one last question. So maybe quickly, Gregor, if you could respond to Niamh Ford, who actually is another alumnus from the school. Niamh did her PhD here a number of years ago. So Niamh is saying, fantastic talk. I was wondering if your samples were from predominantly male or female animals, and if having predominantly one sex or the other would have altered the results you obtained. I presume she's talking primarily about the dog study you talked about first.
So another brilliant question. And we have looked into this. What's great is that when you look into this with wolves, and it turns out in mammoths and in big cats and a whole bunch of other things, there is this weird bias toward males. Now, the argument is that what you have is a whole lot of teenage members of these species getting kicked out of packs or kicked out of groups of these things and going off and doing stupid stuff as teenage males of human species are wont to do. In fact, I understand that the population of everything that's in Natural Trap Cave in Wyoming, the ratio is like 5 to 1 males to females. It's just a bunch of dumb boys doing stuff. And the other interesting thing is that within museum collections, you're seeing a very heavily male bias skew within natural history collections. And that could be because of secondary sexual characteristics. We see this, for instance, with Babirusa, with these giant tusks that the females don't have, and that becomes attractive to the people who are collecting these things. But it could also be because of the circumstance in which these animals are being found in. Now, what's curious is that when we did the male-female relationship with all of our domestic dogs, because even if there's not a whole lot of endogenous DNA, we can map it to the X and see what the ratio is to the autosomes, and we end up with almost 50-50. Which is kind of neat, because that means the domestic populations that we got are what you would expect, even if the wild ones tend to be more heavily male skewed. The only counterexample to this is that there are some sites where we see ritual burial of dogs that with grave goods and with a whole series of other things from archaeologically relevant contexts. And in that situation, at least in one context, there were 7 dogs and they were all male, which is telling us something about the choices that people are making to include those dogs within these burials that were taking place in York 1,000 years ago or so. So that's a great question, because it starts, again, it's another means to get at the natural history of the animals, the behavior of the wild animals, as well as the relationship and our association between humans and the domestic ones as well. It's fantastic.
That's great, Gregor. Thanks. Actually, Robert Sapolsky describes that male-female behavioral sex difference with the one you were talking about as "Dude, where's my frontal cortex?" So I think you might have read that book. But anyway, I think we better finish up there. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of the school and the audience, Gregor, for a fantastic talk. And I'm sure you'll all join me in giving him a virtual clap. And thanks a lot, Gregor.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Just before we finish, just to remind you that the next seminar, which will be held on the 16th of December, is a seminar from Dr. Micheál Flaherty, Women in Irish Agricultural History. And I think there may be a slide going up advertising that just now. But anyway, thanks a lot, Gregor, and look forward to catching up at some stage when the pandemic is over.
Let's do it.
We're all allowed to travel again.
Yeah, a drink and a chat about all this stuff would be outstanding.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.
Thanks again. Bye.